Fog sat in the fields around Arracourt before dawn on September 19, 1944, thick enough that a man standing beside a Sherman could not see the next tank in line. Crews sat inside with the engines off, listening. Somewhere out past the hedgerows, engines were moving, a lot of them, and nobody could see a single one of them. What was coming at them was 2 fresh German armored brigades, and elements of 2 more divisions behind them, close to 260 tanks and assault guns in total, fielded by a Fifth Panzer Army that outnumbered the American screen in front of it several times over. Colonel Bruce C. Clarke's Combat Command A, part of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, held the ground the attackers needed to cross to reach the rest of Patton's 3rd Army. Clarke did not have 260 tanks. He had a fraction of that, spread thin along a line his own corps commander had just ordered him to hold instead of advance from. The German commander, General Hasso von Manteuffel, liked his chances. His brigades were still taking delivery of new Panther tanks from the factory floor when the attack order came, a disadvantage on its face that, on the strength report on his desk, wasn't one. Fresh armor meant a gun that could kill a Sherman before a Sherman got close enough to answer. Manteuffel's staff looked at the tank counts, looked at the open ground east of Nancy, and told him Clarke's division could be cut off, surrounded and finished inside a single day. The first sign of it had come the afternoon before, when German armor hit the 4th Armored's reconnaissance screen at Luneville and was beaten back after losing 24 tanks in the fighting. Major General John Wood, commanding the 4th Armored Division, and his corps commander, Major General Manton Eddy, read that first clash as a local counterattack, nothing that should stop the offensive they had already planned for the following day. Only when reports of heavier German movement kept arriving through the night did they call the offensive off and pull Combat Command A back to consolidate near Arracourt instead. By the time Manteuffel's main attack opened at dawn, the Americans knew something was coming. They still did not know how much of it there was. By mid-morning, it looked like the German staff's estimate might be right. Armor broke through the American outpost line north of Luneville and pushed toward Clarke's own command post, close enough that the staff running it could hear the fighting outside the tent flaps. Behind that lead edge, the soft-skinned trucks and half-tracks that keep a combat command fed, fueled, and in radio contact found themselves boxed in panzers between them and the rest of the division, pinned down, cut off. On the map that morning, the attacking force had done what it set out to do faster than its own planners had promised. The fog did not lift for them. It hung low over the wheat stubble through the whole morning, and it worked against whichever side needed to see the farthest to win. A Panther could open fire on a Sherman at a range where the Sherman's own gun could do nothing back, and that gap in reach was the entire attacking plan compressed into one number on a specification sheet. Fog erased the number. Down at 200 yards, about as far as anyone could see that morning, a Sherman's 75mm gun could put a round through the same Panther's flank or rear just as surely as the Panther could kill it head-on at 1,000 range had stopped mattering. What mattered now was which crew saw the other tank first, and the Americans dug into ground they had already walked on foot the day before, mostly did. Captain Kenneth Lameson's company met 3 Panthers coming out of the mist along the road toward Bézange that morning, close enough to engage before either crew had time to think about range tables, and disabled all 3 inside a few minutes. Lameson then pushed a platoon of Shermans forward to a low ridge, let the same column try to withdraw back through it, and took 4 more tanks from the flank as they passed underneath. His crews were back behind the reverse slope before the survivors could work out where the fire had come from. A few miles south that same morning, 4 AM-18 tank destroyers under Lieutenant Edwin Leiper climbed a rise the local maps called Hill 246. A single enemy tank came out of the tree line at the base of the hill, alone, feeling its way forward through mist it could see through no better than the Americans waiting above it could. Leiper's gunners had the range and the angle worked out before that crew even knew it was being watched, and one enemy tank was not going to be the last one to make that mistake before the morning was over. By the time there was enough light to count wreckage, the brigade that had done almost all of the day's fighting had lost 43 tanks, most of them Panthers, along with roughly 200 infantry. Its sister brigade, delayed disengaging at Luneville the evening before and slow getting into position afterward, reached the battle too late to contribute anything at all. The formation Manteuffel had counted on to close his trap around Clarke's command had gone into action essentially alone that morning and had come apart doing it. Digging up this kind of detail, the machine behind a battle, and not just the battle itself, is most of what this channel exists to do. One campaign at a time, and subscribing is the simplest way to catch the next one when it goes up. Word came down from the high command that night to keep attacking regardless of what the 19th had cost. On the 20th, Manteuffel sent his 2nd Brigade forward alone against a defense that had grown overnight to include a 2nd American Tank Battalion and additional tank destroyers alongside Clarke's original command, outnumbered on paper by roughly 3 tanks to 1 in the American accounting of that day's fighting. The order held anyway. Whatever Manteuffel privately thought about throwing one brigade at a reinforced line a day after watching its sister formation get gutted the same way, nothing in the surviving paperwork records him saying it out loud. What broke the second attack wasn't ground fog alone this time. It was what came after the fog burned off around midday. P-47 Thunderbolts of the Zicknenk Tactical Air Command had been grounded through the worst of the mist that morning, unable to find targets from the air any better than the tank crews below them could find them from the ground. Once the ceiling lifted, the fighter-bombers caught the German columns strung out in the open on the same roads they had used to advance a few hours earlier, and went to work on them from above, while Clarke's tanks kept working on them from ground level below. A capability that had been useless in the dark became, inside the same afternoon, the exact thing the plan had no answer for a second time running. The fighting did not end on the 20th. It ran on for 11 days in total, through the farm village of Arracourt and a string of crossroads nobody outside Lorraine had ever had reason to learn the names of. The 10th Armored Infantry Battalion held ground there through some of the ugliest close-quarters fighting of the whole autumn campaign, house by house and hedgerow by hedgerow, artillery falling on positions too close to their own lines for comfort. No single afternoon after the 20th decided the outcome by itself. Manteuffel kept feeding fresh units into the salient as they became available, sometimes a company at a time rather than a brigade, which tells its own story about what he had left to feed in. Clarke's division, reinforced piecemeal by battalions borrowed from elsewhere in the Corps, kept holding the ground it had been expected to lose in a single foggy morning 11 days earlier, and in several places kept pushing forward from it instead. No surviving German account settles how many tanks Fifth Panzer Army had left in running order by the time the attacks were called off at the end of September. The brigade war diaries were incomplete before the fighting scattered their keepers, and the handful of post-war interviews with surviving officers give figures that do not agree with each other or with the American tallies taken off the battlefield afterward. What both sets of records do agree on, whatever the exact count is, which direction the numbers ran, and which army was doing the counting from a position of strength by the time it was over. When the accounting was as complete as it was ever going to get, the Germans had put somewhere close to 200 tanks and assault guns into the 11 days of fighting around Arracourt and lost most of that force in the process, a large share destroyed outright where they sat, and the rest damaged too badly to matter. Combat Command A's own losses across the same 11 days came to a small fraction of that figure. The division that had been expected to break apart inside a single foggy morning was still sitting on the same ground it had started on and had spent most of the intervening week and a half moving forward from it rather than back. Manteuffel was not a poor commander before Arracourt or after it. He had built a genuine reputation in Russia, and at Arracourt he read the numbers in front of him correctly for exactly what they told him: more tanks, a better gun, a smaller American division holding ground it had no business holding against those numbers. What the paperwork did not tell him was that half his crews had never trained together before that week, that his reconnaissance had missed how thin the American line ran in the places that mattered most, and that the one advantage his tanks held on paper was a gun range advantage that a week of ordinary French autumn weather could cancel outright. A commander can only plan around what shows up in front of him. What showed up in front of Manteuffel was accurate. It just wasn't the weather. One German officer, captured briefly by an American patrol partway through the fighting, was asked how a force with that much armor and that much surprise had failed to close a trap it had clearly set out to close. He gave no answer that satisfied the men questioning him, and the summary of that interrogation, filed and forgotten in a Corps intelligence log, does not record him trying especially hard to invent a better one on the spot. Whatever he believed about the plan he had been sent to execute went into the ground with the rest of what nobody wrote down that week. Clarke carried Arracourt into a long career built partly on what that week had taught him: the tactics his command used there, concealment over range, letting the enemy close the distance instead of trying to match his gun at a distance that favored the enemy's gun, got taught for years afterward at American armor schools as a case study in how a technically outgunned force beats one that isn't. One of the battalion commanders who fought under him that week commanded a battalion of Shermans that killed more armor in less time than almost any American unit had managed up to that point in the war. His name was M1 Abrams, and he went on to lead the entire United States Army by the end of his own career, carrying the lessons Arracourt taught about gun range, armor, and the cost of finding out the hard way which side holds the advantage long after the last wrecked Panther had been cleared from the fields around Lorraine. Decades later, the Army named its next main battle tank after him. It was built from the hull up so that no American crew would ever again need fog, a ridge, and a reverse slope just to get an even fight out of the gun they had been issued to carry.